so welcome back. It's an honor for us to host the next keynote speaker, Dr. Sharon Patricia Holland, and she's a graduate of Princeton University and holds a PhD in English and African American Studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's the author of Raising the Dead, Readings of Death and Black Subjectivity by Duke University Press, which won the Laura Romero First Book Prize from the American Studies Association in 2002. She's also co-author of a collection of transatlantic Afro-Native criticism with Professor Taya Miles, entitled Crossing Water, Crossing Worlds, the African Diaspora in Indian Country, also by Duke University Press. She is the author of The Erotic Life of Racism, a theoretical project that explores the intersection of critical race, feminist, and queer theory. And she's also working on a book project entitled Perishment, a theoretical study that takes German philosopher Martin Heidegger's notion that humans die while animals perish, and reads across the theoretical spectrum of works on the human-animal distinction in order to arrive at a fundamental question. What is the relationship of Blackness to discourse on the animal? Do Black humans die or do we perish? Her work is grounded in the 20th century and encompasses multiple intersections. So welcome, Dr. Holland. It's a pleasure.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really excited to present this work today. I think I'll just start.
Yes, thank you.
So I want to begin first by, thank you, Francisco, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about how I came to this project. I've loved animals since I was a kid and have been involved with horses since I was young, although I took about 20 years out from riding or being engaged with them. And I really wanted to do work in animal studies. And the constant refrain in work in animal studies was that it seemed to elide race, and that was a generous complaint, or not think about race at all. I also wanted to intervene in another way, and that is through the arena of Black studies. I really wanted to see if I could pressure Black studies attempt to think through the human and move, in a sense, that needle over to thinking about the human-animal distinction as not only an intervention for Blackness historically, but also perhaps a problem that discourse in Black studies might be able to solve. So I just want to say that this picture, a snapshot, it's a kind of funny moment. Everyone's like, "Oh, Sharon, is that you with your horse?" But it's not. It's a screenshot that I got out of Charles Burnett's wonderful film, The Horse, made in the early 70s, I think 73 or 74. It's a short. And I have used it here with permission. I want to read the beginning of the work because I think this beginning sets us up for understanding how to really think about the creative process. That is always my process when I begin to write a book. The piece that begins this investigation is a personal piece for me, and I'm going to try to see if I could bring it up, but if I'm not sure if I'm able to see my own screen, so if you'll just give me a second.
Yes.
I will go to Microsoft Word. I love this whole virtual reality. Keeps us on our toes.
True.
Definitely. Let me just find the book. I called it up on one computer, but let me call it up on this one. Let me see. iCloud Drive, so I can read it. This is one of those moments where you're like, see, Sharon, you just should have given yourself the printed out version.
I always do that.
I know, right? I always do that too. And then I'm like, I'm not sure. All right, here we go. Let me see. All right. So I want to read this short piece because I think it's really going to illuminate some of the issues that came up for me when I discovered in thinking through the animal that the older title of the book was, which was Vocabularies of Vulnerability, wasn't those that older title really wasn't where I needed to go with the book itself. So I'll read you this piece. It's very short. The epigraph is from Job 39:19. Hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Number 1, accident. How dare I write to you about accident before love? The autocorrect for oxycodone is oxymoron. I will have to tell friends that my trouble is not a literary one. The ground comes up quickly below me, and I am not stunned, but indignant. Fuckity fuck fuck. Am I really going down? Where is he? How far to my right? Will my outstretched leg catch his panicked hind quarter? This could end up very badly, I think. But before I hit the ground, I take a calculated risk, triangulate the vectors, and decide to twist my body toward the horse. Avoiding the faceplant and head injury, I choose my left shoulder. Am lucky to choose. Black Hawk down, Black Hawk down. I spring up in the corner of my eye, I see the foamy hind end of Petey, all 16 hands moving away from me at a long stride canter with a few bucks thrown in for good measure or for scorn. I cannot say because he is not mine and at this point will never be. Nonetheless, I notice the sheen of his coat and mourn for our fleeting partnership. What happened? An oxymoron. Up, down, slowly faster, unseated rider. I get up so fast that my trainer cheers. I turn to her after seeing Petey galloping down the far fence line, and I raise my right arm for the thumbs up. When I go to lift my left arm, something between brain and shoulder breaks down. I point to the general region of my collarbone and shake my head. Her voice begins to come from far away. I am badly broken, getting high on my personal stash of endogenous morphine. Help. To Morristown Regional Hospital for the verdict. I am indeed broken, a wing that cannot be fixed without incident. My x-ray is a vision of small bones shattered like glass. I need to see a specialist. I hear the soundtrack to The Bionic Woman playing in my head. I will finally get to meet Lindsay Wagner. I smile. The Demerol begins to make me drool. I tell my trainer that I love her, really, and the nurse too, and the little boy by the front desk who stares at me in wide-eyed panic, clutching his mother for dear life against the woman with the shredded shirt and paper bag of hydrocodone and the mud stains down the left side of her riding pants. I will have surgery in 5 days. In the interim, I teach my summer class in a sling, cook dinner for a friend, reminding myself not to move my left wing that little half inch to the right. I forego all attempts to read as I have the attention span of a 12-year-old. I am pleased that my masturbating hand is still good. My left eye now possesses a horse's vision. I see my enemies from 2 separate flanks, and rapid movements make me rear. Recipe for repair of a shattered wing? Do I want a long pin or screws in the plate? The latter. Do I have people who can be with me before, during, and after surgery? Absolutely. Am I allergic to any medications? What? Do I intend to ride again? Yes. Am I insane? Probably. My surgeon comes in with military precision. He marks the spot where the incision will go, noting the fall of my undershirt. He wants to make his mark, but not leave it. My non-bio sister flies down from Boston with my nieces in tow. The Facebook post from the oldest reads, "My crazy auntie got bucked from a horse and we have to go to take care of her." None of us are actually related by blood. We are blood strangers. 24 hours after surgery, they walk into my bedroom with the quiet hum of the ice machine circulating, pumping what is now lukewarm water into the wrap under my arm and around my bandaged incision. Use of this device cuts down by 50% both pain and swelling after surgery. I am a mess of sheets and blankets in the apathy of anesthesia, ringed by a halo of oxycodone. They are worried. How many did you take? No, really. Shite. I am a purist and unused to narcotics. The youngest climbs onto the bed, dragging along her father's iPad. She knows what to do, and the rest follow, until we become a collection of Mac products fanned out among the bed linens, along with the limbs of the dogs, enjoying our togetherness in a haze of cyber love. During my months-long rehab, I read the online results from my rib x-rays and find that they do not describe anyone I know. Impression. The cardiac silhouette is unremarkable for the patient's age. That was number one. Number two, no acute abnormalities in the lungs. Number three, mild scoliosis. Number two, second section, love. My oxycodone dreams are vivid and reek of horseflesh. I no longer recognize my silhouette. Something has happened to me of my own accord. I am now metal, severed nerve, and organic matter. A year later, I circle, urge my horse on, kicking just before the jump cycle to get her up and over. We leave the ground together. This is what love, this might be what love is. Thank you for indulging me. That's the beginning of the book, and it chronicles a pretty bad accident that I had while riding a horse through a field. And I shattered my collarbone. I am now a bionic woman. And what I noticed in that moment is I realized I had been writing about all of these vulnerabilities, right? Precarity, food insecurity, all of these moments that animal studies invests itself in, right? In terms of thinking about scarcity, in terms of thinking about the place of the animal. And I realized that these discourses really didn't capture something that was rather profound for me as a writer. And I noticed that it was profound for other people who were also engaged in animal life, other African descended people. And that was the choice to be vulnerable and the pleasure of the animal. So I wanted to start philosophically with a moment in French phenomenological existential thought. And that's with one of my favorite writers, a quote from Merleau-Ponty's The Visible and the Invisible. And I'll just read it here. From now on, it seems impossible to remain in the inner certitude of him who perceives. Seen from without, perception glides over the things and does not touch them. At most, one will say, if one wishes to admit the perception's own perspective upon itself, that each of us has a private world. These private worlds are worlds only for their titulars. They are not the world. And I start there because in the discussion in animal studies on the human-animal distinction, what makes us animals, as human animals, what makes non-human animals animals, and what is our fundamental difference from one another, it's a theoretical discussion that rages on. I am always interested, particularly in philosophers like Martin Heidegger, who really try to get us to understand that distinction through humans' capacity to world, animals' capacity to be in the world that we create. And one of the things that I got pulled toward in all of this work was not only the relationship of feminist discourse, especially of feminist ethics of care, and the feminist science discourse through folks like Haraway, Adams, and others, is the extent to which that creation of worlds can be tested. that there's a sense that we create the world and other beings live in it, is not necessarily a conceptualization that I believe that feminists in the main accept. And certainly in Black studies, I don't think we accept that at all. As a matter of fact, there's a certain way in Black studies that we are always coming to the thought, right? Or the thought that can be thought within that which is unthought. And so as beings and humans who stand outside tides of thought that relegate us to non-human status, I felt that Black studies has already contributed a lot to animal studies. It's just not being utilized in any way, shape, or form. So this idea that there's a world that humans create that every other being lives in is, to me, a fantasy of how the world actually works. And I can think of nothing, no better example than the present pandemic,
Mhm.
which presents in the US two um, issues: an ongoing problem with racism, clearly,
Yep.
and of course, SARS-CoV-2, which causes the disease that is COVID-19, that is ravaging our communities. And when I say our communities, I mean like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in this country. And so I think that this project is actually landing in a perfect moment. And I also want to acknowledge, in acknowledging accident and in acknowledging love, that there's also great loss in all of these moments that we embrace as scholars. The next point that I actually enjoy is Jacques Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am. And he does a great job in that book of basically putting forth a proof that much of the work in Western philosophy that we've been utilizing to get at the problem of the animal, to get at the question of the animal, doing, isn't really a complete set of works that can help us answer that question, right? And he has this wonderful opening where he talks about the fact that he's getting out of the shower, I believe, or he's standing in his bedroom or bathroom naked before his cat, and he sees his cat looking at him naked, and he wonders about being naked before the animal. And I think that wonderful quote, the animal looks at us and we are naked before it, perhaps perhaps begins there. I put this quote in there because I want to acknowledge that I draw from this work, and also what I believe is the call in Derrida's work for us to think outside of the set of texts that have been given to us to answer questions about animal life and human life. And where I went to immediately in this quest was to think about the work that Black subjects have produced to change the terms of the debate. And I want to think about this moment rather historically. And I think I hope my next slide is going to help do this. So many people, and this is where I put on my historian's hat in my interdisciplinary work, although probably historians out there are going to be like, well, I'm not really sure if that was all that much of a good history, but I will give you the Cliff Notes version. Years ago, I was doing this work on the internet, and I began to pick up writing again about over a decade ago, when I came back to the Triangle. And my people are from North Carolina, and many folks don't know, but late, in the mid 1800s, Black subjects in North Carolina, enslaved subjects, on the backs of, I think, 3 or 4 quarter horse mares, ran the first race in this nation and opened up the sport of racing as, quote unquote, America's first sport. And that tradition of Black people being involved with horses goes back to the slaveocracy in particular, and to the transatlantic slave trade and Malenke people, who were very much versed in horsepersonship, actually were brought over from the continent of Africa to work in the horse/racing trade. And that in many ways is a tradition that, in my opinion, as African descended subjects, we fully inhabit. It is our tradition. And it wasn't until sometime in, I think, 1913, right around the height of lynching in this country. And, Ida B. Wells's work so beautifully documents the terror of that moment from 1898 to 1913 for African descendant peoples in this country. But this jockey tradition was started by people of African descent. We became trainers and jockeys, and we put poultices on horses. We worked with indigenous and native communities to provision herbs and to come up with remedies for keeping horses working, keeping them sound, keeping them fit. And by 1913, the last African descendant jockey had won the Kentucky Derby, and we wouldn't be in the Derby for many decades. And these jockeys were basically terrorized out of their position in the sport. And so when I was going on the internet to see if I could find Black jockeys in particular and talk a little bit about them in the book, I came upon Sylvia Harris and her memoir. She is the winningest Black female jockey. Memoir was published in 2011. And this is one of my favorite quotes from it. Me, I have two rituals. I chant, and then before I mount the horse, I breathe him in. I know it sounds a little horse whisperish, but when I breathe in a horse, it's as if we are kindred souls. We are one. And what I love about this quote from Sylvia Harris is, it definitely shows somebody who has not only a deep relationship to non-human animal life, but someone who's well-versed in how to understand, how to relate to that life. And as a rider of a horse who looks very much like the horse that she's riding here, I ride a quarter horse, although that's clearly a thoroughbred. I ride a quarter horse. Her name is Annie. She's feisty. She's a chestnut. And when I get up on my horse, even though I might be the only African descended person at my barn, and even though people might look at this as an anomaly, I feel like when I am on Annie, the minute I enter an arena or the minute we're out in the field, I know that I am participating in a centuries old tradition for my people. And so part of the work that I want to do in this book is to bring that history back to us and to contemplate it. If we have shaped racing, haven't we also shaped what America, what the United States relationship to the being of horses is in this country? And isn't that participation significant? And I can think of no other significant rendering of that relationship and its complexities, especially than in Charles Burnett's short, The Horse, which I'm not going to talk about in this presentation, but I urge you through the Criterion collection to get a hold of it. It is a beautiful short film, and it ends in it's a horse that has to be put down because of illness. And Charles Burnett is a LA Rebellion Black filmmaker, is just phenomenal in really pointing toward the relationship of Blackness to animals, while also pointing toward how that relationship is made within the context of a racist society. So one of the key works, and I always like to introduce Charles Mills's work to audiences when I do give presentations. One of the key works, I think, in this whole in the philosophical work in Black studies on our relationship to not only contract theory, political theories, but also in our relationship to the way those social contracts are carried out. I can think of no finer work than what Professor Mills does in The Racial Contract. And he writes, thus, in effect, on matters related to race, the racial contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. And not only is this text beautifully written, but I've quoted this passage in my The Erotic Life of Racism text, and I also quote it in this book. I think there's a through line. And what Charles Mills's work tells us is that when we're thinking about political theory, we will look at so many texts. We will look at pragmatism, Nussbaum. We will look at, we will go in philosophy from Aristotle all the way up to the present. But the one system that has helped glue the globe together economically and glue the globe together in terms of social contracts, which would be white supremacy, remains in a sense unremarked upon. And so his book really tries to unravel that contract, especially for racial others. And I want to move on to another moment. So I've talked a little bit about Burnett and kind of how the LA film folks, LA Rebellion Film School folks in the 70s really began to address questions about Blackness and Black being outside of like the standard lists of questions and texts that people were pulled toward that were not necessarily Black authored and Black thought. And one of the groups that I've always been drawn to, and this is perhaps because as a girl child and as a young college student, this group was very much in the psychic life of Blackness for me, and that is the MOVE organization out of Philadelphia, which arranged itself as a group sometime in the early 70s, had its first incarnation in Powelton Village in 1978. That house was bulldozed by the Philadelphia police in 1979. The picture that I have here is of the house on Osage Avenue, perhaps its most famous and most known incarnation, because this is the house that the Philadelphia police on May 13th in 1985 chose to bomb. And in bombing that house, they incinerated 60 other homes in 2 square blocks in the center of that particular neighborhood in Philadelphia. It was an astoundingly devastating event for the city, for its Black residents, and for its political life. But one of the things that most people don't know about MOVE that I was drawn to is a statement, and I hope you can see it, excuse me, in this slide. And I'll just read it, the first
Yes.
of it. The House of John Africa is built on the foundation of life. And if you notice at the door, at the porch, right at the end, you'll notice that where the gate swings open, there's a dog standing.
Mhm.
Yes. And the red line is, this is actually archival footage that was taken. I want to give credit to the foundation. I mean, the library is taken from the Temple University archives for the MOVE, and it's in their digital photograph section. And the photographs that are there have the crop lines for the newspapers. And this one is from the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin. And I love this picture because one of the things that people don't know about MOVE is that they actually had an animal liberation platform. And I know, and this is like the most, to me, it just made my, young girl heart just soar when I discovered it. And I was like, "What? How do we not know this?" And so I make an argument in my book that we have dealt with an animal studies that thinks about animal liberation through a lens of what I call occupying whiteness. And that lens needs to be widened. And actually people say, if you look in the archive, newspaper archives, you'll see the first articles about Ingrid Newkirk's group coming out in 79, 80. Well, actually, the first incarnation of MOVE's platform for animal liberation started in 73 and 4 when they would hold protests at zoos, at circuses in the city, and at puppy mills. And they have not been really given credit for the work that they did. And not only that, and this I think is key, is in this precise moment of how Move was treated by the city, as a Black Studies scholar, I want people to see that Move was impacted not only because of the brief they had for Black life, Black living, Black lives matter to us, Black living matters, but for the stance on life, which you see across a range of Black revolutionary platforms. But in particular, you see that their connection with animal life and understanding of it is also, I want to argue in my book, another reason why Rizzo, who led an incredibly racist administration in the city of Philadelphia in the 70s and 80s and early 80s. And you see that this complete racist structure came down on them so hard because people were not able to see all of the ways in which their platform fanned out and touched all living, not just Black living. And so I use them as a forgotten example of Blackness's intervention into animal discourse, intervention in so many ways in terms of food. They believed in raw food, just like Dick Gregory. I want people to see that they are not a radical fringe group, but are actually in a long line of continuum of radical Black activists who consider the way we eat, who consider the way we live together, who consider the life forces of other beings in their platform for liberation and justice. And so it's an incredibly long chapter. It took me a while to write, but I'm really hugely excited about bringing this work in particular in this book to a more public audience. So thank you for the opportunity here. Um, There's a wonderful, I work in the book on Toni Morrison's, a chapter is on Toni Morrison's and Mercy. And a part of that has already been published, I think in a volume called After Queer. And I'm really proud of this essay. This essay in particular takes into this chapter takes into consideration Toni Morrison's attempt to think about the world, the world in the United States before we became, before race is sedimented. So you're looking at kind of like 18th century kind of incarnation of subjects living in a certain part of the United States, in Maryland in particular. And so the quote I have here is, "Where else but in this disorganized world would such an encounter be possible?" One of the things I notice in Mercy is that the book opens with great consideration of animal life and metaphors of animal life. But more importantly, one of the questions that haunts the outer edges of that book is indigenous sovereignty and issues of sovereignty. And as you know, as many of you might know out there, that animal studies takes on issues of sovereignty, in particular in political theory, in terms of the sovereign right of the kings, which was, overturned for Enlightenment. And with the Enlightenment, we get a social contract. Man becomes at the center, and we leave behind, the sovereign king, but we also pick up vestiges of power. And this could move us into work on the biopolitical, and obviously on Foucault. What I'm concerned with is how those discourses in animal studies, in particular on sovereignty, interact with other thoroughgoing discourses about sovereignty and political theory as political theory and indigenous work. And so this chapter works out this relationship through a character in Toni Morrison's novel. And I think I have a few more slides left, but one of the things that I also would like to do in this piece in this book is to talk about diversity, not diversity from the vantage point of the university, right? Where, we're like, the United States is obsessed with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a critical race theorist, I'm not really all that much in agreement with modes of equity, although I support them on my campus because my disagreements are more historical and linguistic.
Right. Right, right, right.
Right. But diversity is so central. And what I do in this book is I try to talk about my own experience of being in a meeting where I was representing LGBTQ peoples on campus, but the person at the meeting thought I was representing Black constituencies on campus. And when I arrived at the meeting, there was a sign that had my name, right? So you should get the first clue is that if I go to sit by the sign that is my name, I probably have picked the right place, but the person corrected me and said, blah, 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 I've left placards for people's names. And I turned over my placard. I looked at it and I said, yep, this is me. I'm in the right place. And basically it was like cognitive dissonance. Like, you're not sitting in the Black seat, right? And so they started calling me by the name of the person who they thought was supposed to be representing Black folks on campus, which I've often done on campus, And I said, I was extremely puzzled. And then the person who actually was representing, the Black faculty, staff, and student committee for the provost, provosts always have these university life committees, and many of us get assigned to them, came in, she looked at me and she realized her mistake. And so diversity, in my opinion, can take a page out of the way in which animal studies folks discuss diversity, and that modernity has cost existence its diversity. It has drained the Earth's capacity to maintain life. Modernity sustains the disappearance of animals as a constant state. And what I want to say is diversity sustains the disappearance of us as human animals as a constant state, right? So diversity is actually on college campuses is a discourse about scarcity. It's not necessarily a discourse about increasing our numbers. And so I use that little anecdote to really drive home that, you can only be one body on campus for so many people when you're doing this work. And that's a problem for doing this work adequately. And so the other thing that I want to talk about, and I know I'm getting up. I think I'm getting up on my time. I'm about at half an hour right now. Is that where we are?
Yes, that's totally fine.
Wonderful, wonderful. Just wanted to check.
Mhm.
The next, I first started out, like I said, this project, and I called it Vocabularies of Vulnerability, and I wanted to put in all of these different vocabularies and name different chapters: precarity, slow death, etc. But then I began to think after the accident that this idea that Black subjects can be taken whenever people want to take us and wherever actually goes against a way of Black living and a way to make Black lives matter to ourselves and others. And so I wanted to push back on this notion that as a Black subject, I am always already open to certain discourses of precarity, which is not to say that there are Black subjects who are open, but even in those moments, there are modes of pleasure that we choose for ourselves in our family life, in our extended family life, in our community life. And one of those modes, I cannot tell you how many times in my local community, I consider myself a country queer. I don't live in a rural place. I'm only 8 minutes from a grocery store. But every time someone comes out here, they're like, well, Sharon lives in the country. I'm like, I'm 10 minutes from school. Like, how can that be the country? As soon as people cross a bridge with some water under it, they get a little nervous, right? So, but I cannot tell you how many times when I've gone to the dump, I'll see a African descended person there, and they'll see my truck, and they'll see the horse insignias on my truck, and I'll see the horse insignias on theirs, and we'll pull next to one another, and we're like, "What do you ride?" And they're like, "I had about 4 quarter horses, a couple Percheron, mixes," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I ride a quarter horse," and we'll spend half an hour talking about the pleasure of riding, talking about how this is something we do for ourselves and how it's tied to a unique and particular history. So in those moments, the kind of precarity we feel, even in a rural space, quote unquote, right? Even as African descendant subjects who might not necessarily be recognized in that space. I feel like we do ourselves a great service in those moments, and we push back against these languages of precarity and vulnerability that we're constantly told to inhabit. So this is just a nice little picture of me at one of my, please don't look at my form. It's a little bit, it's not the best, but this is my horse, Annie. I digitally altered the picture. As again, she's a chestnut, and you can't see her eye in this picture, but she's actually looking back at me. And we are at a full-on canter getting ready to take another jump, during a show, a Fenridge show in October 2013. It's one of my favorite pictures of the two of us together. And then, of course, there's a little bit more that I have to say in the book on sovereignty. But in the interest of time, I think I might come back to that slide. Um, and I wanted to point to this because I think it's important. And this slide, as opposed to the earlier one on sovereignty, I love Achille Mbembe's work, and I think one could say that he falls into the Black pessimist tradition, although I feel like that's sometimes a very odd moniker, as even Wilderson himself points out, and a lot of people tend to come up under it. But I really think he's one of the most persistent and consistent thinkers about how to think through the unthought. And I love this quote from him: "The romance of sovereignty rests on the belief that the subject is the master and the controlling author of his or her own meaning." And I think this has great purchase in the work in animal studies, because this is what it's like to be vulnerable to another being, not just the relationship one has with a pet, but a relationship one has with a being who you must, in many ways, learn to communicate with in some way together, because that being is so much bigger than you are. It's
Mhm.
11 pounds of horse, you can get it wrong very easily. And so I think that Mbembe's work really opens up the possibility of thinking sovereignty differently from the kind of Western tradition of always already thinking of sovereignty as overcoming, as a certain kind of mastery, as a certain kind of worlding. So I think of him in the spectrum of Black thought that's trying to undo these particular belongings. Um, so I want to end here on a quote. And I want to demonstrate like how ubiquitous this whole this work from Heidegger is really. One of the statements in Heidegger's big book is that humans die while animals perish. And what it means to perish as a non-human animal is to perish in the open without protection and consciousness of one's own death, while humans have a consciousness, right? But of course, when you look at the work of Western philosophy, especially Enlightenment philosophy, you find that part of its mission was proving the non-humanity of Blackness. So how, in this ordering of things, do we account for Blackness in this strict dichotomy between human animal distinction? And this is one of my, I feel like this distinction is so much on people's minds that it actually winds up in a novel, right? And Edward P. Jones's novel, The Known World, and there's a cast of characters. I would love to be able to like distill the plot, but I'm no good at that because it really is. It reminds me of Leslie Marmon Soko's Almanac of the Dead. You have to read it, and then we can talk about the plot, right?
Mhm.
But this is one moment where one of the folks in the story is about African descendant people who also own slaves. So the plot line is very controversial and was at its time and still is. But I think that Jones wrote the novel in order to demonstrate the ways in which the enslavement of African descendant peoples was ubiquitous in the culture of modernity. So here's the quote. So, Tops, the Atlanta insurance agent, said as he finalized everything, there will be no protection at this time on the perishment of your human property. Perishment, or natural death, was a word the people of Atlas used very often, and no one used it more than the widowed Topps, who saw himself as one day ascending to an important position at the Home Office in Hartford, Connecticut. And if folks don't know this, that's like the center of insurance in the United States.
Mhm.
And looking down over the land and dispensing wisdom learned from years toiling in the wilderness of the uninsured. The word perishment had been thought up by a man at the Hartford office to try to convey the fragility of human life, especially that of slaves, and to try to get across to a customer the utter need for Atlas's policies on those whose lives, slave or otherwise, on those lives, slave or otherwise, end quote. And what I think is phenomenal about this is the way in which those qualities of distinction that that pertain when you're thinking about perishment, right? Or when you're thinking about dying, for the sake of capitalism, don't pertain at all. Enslaved subject position and freed subject position are completely mapped onto one another for profit,
Mhm.
which also demonstrates in many ways the instability of the distinction between human animal through perishment and dying, or dying and perishment, and also the distinction right here that between enslaved subject, right, and freed, you know, slash white subject.
Mhm.
So I'd like to end there. I think it's a good note to end on, and see if we could maybe enter into, any kind of questions you might have about the project. Thank you
Absolutely.
for letting me
Thank
come.
you so much.
No, it's our pleasure. It's wonderful. And I took a lot of notes on the process of your presentation, because there's a lot of intersections that I see with residencies, and a lot of what you mentioned, like for instance, when you are forced to occupy a specific place in this meeting, it's something that we have encountered over and over again, and that we have been thinking about over and over again, because of place and how place is invented. And usually when I was part of the residency network, the larger residency network, which of course is Eurocentric, and it's based in the Netherlands. And
Mhm,
every time I would present our program, they would get confused, because they thought by having me being from Mexico, putting me in the place of history that they imagined, then I was in their mind being forced to perform a
mm,
specific class in relation to privilege. And
mhm,
every time I would present many of the concepts, including some of the concepts in your book that challenge the history of place, they
mhm.
would get shocked, they would get confused. So I want to open the conversation with this idea of how place is invented, because as you mentioned, we also don't believe in this term of diversity, or
Mhm,
even minority, because minority is actually a verb, not a noun. It's minoritization. It's a process,
mhm,
and it
mhm,
has nothing to do with the number of people that are grouped in a specific community. It's this idea of how you become a minor that has no will in the social contract. So
mhm.
one of the interesting things that we have explored in this symposium, in the Grand Tour, is how do we extend this conversation to larger audiences, which was a challenge in the beginning. And then we have found out that although there are many differences in terms of how places are invented, for instance, Nepal versus Mexico, or
Mhm.
Tanzania or Macedonia, what is interesting is that the social contract prevails.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the social contract, and how it invents, how it's invested in creating place.
Yes. Thank you so much. That's such a great question. There's so many nuances there. I think my first thing I want to say, I'm glad you're bringing me back actually to the quote itself, my slide,
Mhm.
because, you know, there's the thing that Mills really puts his finger on that is so useful for us
Mhm.
as, and I consider myself now, I tell people that I am Black because I believe in Black revolutionary struggle. I am African descended because all humanity is descended from Africa, from the continent, right? And then I'm African American because of my cultural upbringing in the United States.
Mhm.
So
Right.
the children that I used to take care of said, so basically you're triple Black. And I'm like, well, kind of, right? But I think that one of the things that Mills points to in that racial contract is the blindness that coheres for whiteness
Mhm.
in order for that contract to become settled.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we're doing is we're saying, stop putting us in our place, literally, all over the globe right now. We're
Mhm.
saying, look look at your blindness. Look at the ways in which you don't see any of us moving about, and not below you, all around you every day, right? And so I feel like this contract settles for whiteness a blindness. And I don't even want to use that term in that way. Because in many ways it can be pejorative, right? I think maybe I could say it's a lack of vision. And so when all of a sudden when racism rears its ugly head, that's why
Mhm.
you get that standard, I'm so surprised, right?
Right.
Because but I keep saying you're raised to not see it. So you need to unsee, right? You need to
Right.
Right.
unsee constantly. So my thing is I want, I mean, the way we look at this now, I think was not even in this moment, right? In this moment of, struggles against global, racism,
Mhm.
or global, sorry, anti-racist discussion. Forgot to turn my messages clean off. But um, I feel like in this moment, we are saying we've all been doing this work over here, which is not over here to many of us, right? Which
Mhm.
is a majority culture, which is a majority culture.
Yeah.
And you're just getting hip to it, So, you know, sit down, take a seat, and listen for a change. So I feel like that social contract that says that they're inviting us in as
Mhm.
the one, group, the one person who can give them something.
Mhm.
The first thing that I like to resist is that, people are like, well, you need to make the theoretical more intelligible. So we make everything so intelligible and still no one's listening. So
Mhm.
basically, I think what the global movement is allowing us to do now is to say, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to give you this platform, and it's actually been going on for a couple hundred years. Anytime you want to like get read up and do the work you need to do to understand its
Right.
message, that's your choice. I think we're also breaking right now the global social contract.
Mhm.
But
Yes.
and what I mean by that is that we're showing that it's already broken. We never
Right.
True.
signed up for it. We never embodied it, and look at what happened with Mr. Cooper in Central Park. The minute an African descended subject tells a white subject what the law is, the white subject reminds that black African descended subject that they own the law. So we can't
Right.
participate as citizens, right? In
Right.
that, that to me is a perfect, and she tapes her encounter with him. She tells him on tape, I'm going to call the police and basically attempt murder on you,
Right.
telling them to come here, that you're trying to assault me and for them to
Yeah.
come here, knowing that when they arrive, they will see a historical instance, not a
Mhm.
social contract broken, and they will most likely kill you.
Yep.
And it was publicized for all the world to see.
Yes, and one of the challenges that we faced from the beginning when we started Architopia is first of all that these contracts are usually mediated by place and meaning Europe and
Right.
meaning the United States,
Mm.
not conceding the center. It's not that we imagine it as a center, but it's a funnel in which relationships are mediated.
Mhm.
And the challenge that we faced is how do we figure out that the terms of the social contract, when someone who enters place, meaning Mexico, as they imagine Mexico, and encounters someone who is imagining place through class and not race. So we have two social contracts to name in a specific way colliding. And one of the things that we had to face through the process of Architopia is, yes, we understand racism. How do we deal with that in a place where class is even more vicious? And what we found is that Mexico started importing the language of race in the 20th century. And that is to say not necessarily that Mexico can be racist as a place, because it is and it can be, but also to understand that public policy in this moment is actually only addressing race in Mexico when race is not even the real or the signifier that is the most important. And I always disclose this to artists. The term indigenous has no translation in the 68 native languages of Mexico. There's no translation for that term, which only discloses how the problem of class has been even more successful in establishing a social contract.
Right.
So how do we move from there? And this is also fascinating when we started the symposium, the end of the grand tour, with a question mark, because a lot of the residencies that are joining in the conversations were saying, how did we not know others were having these problems? How is it possible that I thought I was the only residency, maybe in Nepal or maybe in Macedonia, or the place where they have their location, and didn't know that these conversations were necessary, or were happening in other places? So with that, I want to introduce the problem of the encounter. And your book, The Erotic Life of Racism, opens up with that experience that all of our artists in residence remember. They never forget about that experience. It is probably the most important experience to understand how place is invented, how we're being fixed in place through gender, through race, through class, through age, even nationality. So I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yes, and I realized too that part of the earlier question you asked talked about place, so I'm glad you came back to it. I think when I was working on the book, one of the readers was worried about that anecdote because they felt it was like, drawing too much attention to the self of the author, and pulling us away from some of the larger debates in the book. And I argued that my narrative and my experience is the only one that I do own.
Yes.
Right.
Therefore, I can subject it to scrutiny. And I feel that this is the problem of precarity is not necessarily the invested precarity of Blackness or brown peoples or indigeneity or Native peoples, at least in the US context. The problem of precarity is the precise moment that someone, like that person in Central Park, decides who you are, right? And I think one of the things that you pointed toward in talking about the situation in Mexico in particular, is the importance of bringing indigeneity and in bringing Native peoples into, in bringing them into a conversation about race. Because, and I hope this is going, this is answering your question in a way you thought my work might intersect. And I'm just thinking in the United States that one of the things that's really is a wonderful colleague here, Emil Keme, who is a professor in Romance languages and has done a lot of work to bring us up to speed about what's happening at Trump's border, right? And that the problem at the border is, yes, a problem of immigration, but is also a problem of food systems. It is a problem of class. It is a problem of indigeneity, that so many of the people are fleeing the situation. Mayan peoples are fleeing the situation. So many folks are fleeing the situation in the Amazon, right? And these folks are considered immigrants who are all then considered by most Americans as Mexicans, right? And so I think one of the things that we can do is to constantly complicate the picture.
Right.
Constantly complicate the picture and to understand that, what brings people to our borders, right, is a combination of factors, all of them driven by capital, right, and by forms of policing, which are actually increased by forms of capital, right? And so when you have that as kind of a central problem, then you have the problem of class, right? Because
Right.
capitalism relies upon class distinction in
Absolutely.
really rigid ways, right? And so, the way in which place becomes configured for especially people of color and indigenous and Black peoples in this country is through modes of capital where you can be seen, right?
Hmm.
So farm workers are invisible, and because of their invisibility in that capitalist structure, farm workers are therefore flattened, right? As
Right.
one kind of worker. Illegality, right? And deterritorial, people don't understand that what's happening at the border is a process of deterritorialization for indigenous peoples in South America, Mexico, and elsewhere, right?
Right, because the only way to be visible is through citizenship. And
Mhm.
and once you have no property, then there's no possibility to exercise citizenship.
And that's something that that the good old U.S. law just loves, right? That's the thing that I always tell my students that I said, what rights do you have that cannot be secured, that can be secured without property?
Hmm.
And when we go through that exercise in my class, after 20 minutes, they're enraged. They're like, I rent, like I don't have anything. I'm like, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Like, they realize, wait a minute. I'm like, because if you wanted to make a change in the property, if somebody came to hurt you on that property,
Right.
your landlord actually have to sign on to your redress because it's their property. If it involved coming
Yeah.
in, and they're like, wait a minute.
Mhm.
I said, you would have a much better time. I mean, it wouldn't be that, if you got assaulted in your home, of course, you would have redress in the courts. But what I'm
Right.
saying is that it would be much better for you if it were your own home, as opposed to a home owned by someone else, that your rights are curtailed by your connection to property, right? Which
Right.
also produces place. This is the
Absolutely.
problem of the deterritorialization. Well, like, how can you
Right.
prove you were in that place? What's the first thing that happened? Well, we can take all of these lands because their land is empty. I'm talking about the pilgrims, some of the early colonial thought. Their land is empty. Our land is full because land that just is not being colonized by husbandry or
Hmm.
most husbandry is automatically considered unused. Right? And so the very conceptualization, the thing that allows Europeans to come here and deterritorialize this part of the world is through the idea of what property is. And
Yes,
plus,
absolutely.
you have no
Absolutely.
place because you're not cultivating it. If you have a mountain, you must show you're using it. Otherwise, we're going to take your mountain from you.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the conversation that is missing. Even when we think about indigeneity, there's no conversation about class.
Mm.
There are different classes between, among different groups, different cultures, different regions, different spaces. So this is why I always think about class as probably the only space in which change can happen.
Mhm.
Because there's conversations about race, there's conversation about gender, there's never a conversation about class. It's always being hidden.
Well, one of the things too, I think that's really important here is that, I think it comes out of like solidarity movements too. Is that, one of the things that Black feminism puts forward, and I talk about it in the book a little bit, is intersectionality, right?
Mhm.
That, I operate a fund, a survival fund. It's called QTIPOC. In this country, that stands for queer, trans, indigenous, people of color. And it's a lot of mutual funds sprang up during the onset of stay-at-home orders across the globe because
Mhm.
of COVID. And I started a mutual fund. And one of the things that I think that mutual fund's growth and the other ones that have popped up across the country and the world, although they might not be called mutual aid funds, is precisely from the language of intersectionality and Black feminism, which says that I am not going to let you separate my class status from my embodiedness, separate my gender from my, I'm not going to let you speak to me as an individual in this realm. I want you to take your vertical organization and I want you to turn it horizontal. So that I can exist as I am across the several communities that I care for. And so I think intersectionality has really provided a way to break through that problem, because people are like, I want to see it through race. I want to see it through class. Well, the intersectional analysis says that, even, there's all kinds of ways in which in indigenous communities and native communities here, you see the workings of class, right? You see some folks who live as quote unquote urban Indians. You see some folks who've lived, in what is considered the deterritorialized reservation system, which is always already a process of deterritorialization. And so you see folks living in different class statuses, obviously, and federal recognition processes and other ways of engaging with those peoples using that system of class difference by place, right? As a tool, right? To disenfranchise people. I mean, like you said about citizenship,
Right.
no citizenship, no place. Like, so you don't even have a place at the table, right? So anyway, I don't know if that gets at some of what you're talking about, but I think the intersectionality might help there. And it's something that's been really fruitful, and, been well critiqued, soundly critiqued, and rightfully so, but also really fruitful and not giving up that multi status. That's why, like, when people say I'm not a minority, like, if I look at all the different statuses I occupy, I'm actually pretty healthy, robust majority.
Right. Yes, and while you were presenting, I was thinking about oxymoron as the pursuit of the symposium, because how do we challenge when we think about residencies and we think about the grand tour, they cannot be separated. And this is a question that is loaded, because we are pushing it to understand the encounter as that moment in which we maybe for a few seconds can see each other beyond how we've been organized through place and history. And I really like how you were explaining the perception of the world is not the reality, it's only my perception. And how you mentioned the choice to be vulnerable, and to me that's what residencies are all about. We were having this discussion with other panelists in previous sessions, and one of them was Emily Jassir. She was talking about how she sees residencies, the projects of each one of the residents, as failed from the beginning, which is it's the point. The point is to fail, and the point is to experiment. And that I when you were speaking about vulnerability, I saw the connection. So I wanted to ask the question of how do we pursue vulnerability, specifically when we think about residencies and the oxymoron of being that contradiction between the grand tour and the residency, and bringing it back to the encounter.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I just love what you're saying about just, choosing to be vulnerable, and how that's an oxymoron. And what was that last part? The last part of the question. Say it again.
Yes,
The
when the
Yeah.
encounter, yes.
Yeah.
Face-to-face encounter.
Yeah, I had something in my head. Everyone says it's COVID brain, right? We're all under, and like you do things, and at the end of the day, you're like, wait a minute, like I was thinking that, and now it's completely gone. But just in terms of how does one become vulnerable? By thinking of vulnerability outside the terms in which the social contract has dictated it, right? And so this vulnerability, I choose it because I think the vulnerability is the way in which one gains knowledge of another, not the other, small t, capital T, but another, right? And that one has to see that in this planetary scheme of things, we are all beings, right? Trying to live our best lives, which is why I love that move. The House of John Africa is built on the foundation of life. It almost every time I read it, it makes me want to cry because it's simple. And it doesn't say, and it's not a politic. It's not like choice versus abortion. It's not put into binaries. It's like is built on the foundation of life. Go find your Black living. Go find that space where you live that's not dictated by some outside um, contract or arena or voice that tells you that word for it, that delegitimizes that living. And I think I've learned that most as a queer subject, right? That I had to
Right.
find a way of Black living that was consistent with who I was in the world.
Mhm.
And how do we keep being vulnerable? I think the second part of that is I want to say that as pedagogically, I teach from a vantage point of failure. I tell
Mhm.
all of my students if the beginning of doing anything is to fall flat on your face,
Mhm.
literally, for me with horses. And I feel like every day is a struggle back to my horse. Every day is, okay, I'm going to do this, and it's like something that I feel like I fail at all the time. I love to have connection with her. She's amazing. She's also really opinionated, and
Mhm.
she's great in that she carries me. She's not a dumper. There's some horses that if they don't like what you're doing, they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you wind up on the ground again?" Um, she's just basically like she'll put her ears back and be like, "No, seriously, I don't like that." Right? And so I feel like, some days I get down and I'm like, "Well, that last trot circle was good," And it just taught me to be, and I feel like I don't like to use the word humble, right? Because that is a certain kind of genuflection. What it's taught me is that failure is the way that we create intimacy. And this entire society is set up to preclude that possibility. So definitely like that failure.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes me think of how the history of the world as we understand it in as a single narrative that has to be always challenged has for centuries invented people who need to perish, and not even people. It's the history of how
Mm.
we have been perceived as animals or as um, objects who, living objects who occupy space. And what I find also very important in what you are presenting today is how the history of what has not history, how do we understand and challenge history of non-humans? Because as you're explaining, when we have find this connection with a quote unquote animal, we are there naked because anything that we understand as the social construction is probably understood differently there. And
Mhm.
it's a valuable lesson when we encounter anyone, and specifically when we think about residencies, it's all about encounters. So I wonder if you could expand on that, the valuable lessons of encountering non-humans and how that could reinsert new narratives in history.
Oh, I think that's so important. There's a section of the book that I had in my earlier slide presentation, but I've cut it down because the other one was it was pretty robust and it kind of went down theoretical avenues that may or may not be interesting, except for, to me. So, but the one that I borrow from Deleuze and Guattari is the notion of thresholds. And the threshold is that kind of meeting, that encounter. And I guess what I do, in that moment, they open up the possibility that a threshold might not be a place of destruction. It might actually be a place of generation. And so I think of that moment of encounter as significant, right? And I think of other beings. I feel like our religious lives have, and I hear this from my students in my animal studies course, and I try to talk to them a little bit about this. And sometimes I have students who are like, our job, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is always already a misnomer, so I'll just say the Christian tradition is to have um, dominance, dominion, not dominance over animals.
Right.
And I always say to them, well, actually, that's a really bad translation from the Aramaic, that actually dominion is a poor translation. We are here to have oversight and connection. We are here to make sure that we don't have a species extinction event. That's actually our job, right? And if you think about it, even in the context of Christianity, right? I'm not a practicing Christian, and so I don't, but I, am a literary scholar, so I think of the Bible as a literary text in many ways, and I try to talk to my students in particular about what it means to connect with other beings and what it means for you as human being to let go of overcoming, to let go of worlding, to let go of your sense. And think about it this way. If the entire mass of ants in the earth, on the earth, is equal to that of human being, then we have a really skewed sense of who we are. And so I talk to my friends, like I want to wear a shirt saying "Rising of the Ants," "Rising of the Ants." And I always tell my students at any moment, if the ants decided, because they're extremely organized, right? But they're almost OCD-ish in their organizational structures, right? But if they decided they were going to connect with one another outside those structures for about 10 minutes on the planet, we'd all be gone. Because all they'd have to do is rise up and they could pretty much take us. Right? And I said, that's just one species. Why is it that we think we can go into a wood anytime we want to and cut down a tree?
Right.
Without actually thinking about what that would mean for ourselves, or that it would have this idea that like we can do things because capital drives us to do things, and
Right.
those things will have no ill effect on us whatsoever. And I tell people, I said, North Carolina kills 32,000 pigs a day, not 3,000, not 10,000, but 32,000 pigs a day. There are more hogs in North Carolina than there are people. And they are going to slaughter.
Right.
For that thing called Southern barbecue. And the waste, the waste from those operations sit in lagoons about 2,500 feet from mostly people of color and indigenous lands.
Right.
They certainly don't sit in the middle of Chapel Hill. So caring about other beings, caring about food systems, I think that caring about other beings produces the interconnectivity. Right? I think one of my favorite books that illustrates this, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Paul Farmer's work on Haiti and AIDS. And it really he's a medical anthropologist, and he basically talks about how he wanted to answer the question, why was HIV/AIDS so impactful in Port-au-Prince in Haiti? And in that study, you have the building of a dam, the killing of a what's it called, indigenous pig, the Creole pig, the introduction of a corn-fed American pig, and the loss of lands through the building of the dam. And then all of a sudden you have folks at Port-au-Prince right at the apex, at the beginning of the HIV outbreak. And so you have what you call a perfect storm. Right. And so what he wanted to do is, people were saying, that what was happening in this country, that, it was what was happening in Haiti was because of Haitians. And he said, actually, what's happening in Haiti is an event that's caused by a series of other events, right? Produces a discourse.
Right.
And so I feel like that's the connected scholarship that I like to do. And I think that when you connect, you can say that the Creole pig survivance might have saved lots of lives.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think this is the direction in which conversations should be happening. It's not about it's not the conversation, I don't see race, I see humans. It's actually challenging the notion of humans. And I wonder, something that you mentioned that is very it's at the core of this idea of modernity and the invention of humans is whiteness. And I wonder if you could expand on the concept occupying whiteness, because it would also be very useful to understand how other residencies in the world tackle with the problem of history and the invention of place.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I remember it was so funny during the presentation, I remember saying occupying whiteness, and I was like, oh, okay, well, I didn't know where that came from, but that is exactly what that was exactly what I was thinking at the time. But what I mean by that is this sense that there's a profound misunderstanding of who we are as a people in the world. And I feel like the youth in this country and around the globe are getting that. They got that. And they're delivering a message. You don't understand. You don't see our pain. You don't understand who we are. Let us tell you who we are by taking to the streets to say, we don't want you to relate to us this way. We want you to demilitarize and defund the police. And I think part of that is understanding that there's an occupying whiteness, right? A kind of a structure that unsees us everywhere we are. And what we want to point to is that you have to strip us of our humanity first. That's an action in
Right.
order to see us as someone that you can put your knee, who you can put your knee on to cause our death. So we are no longer just looking at that incident. We are actually expanding our vision. And I don't mean we as an activist. Activists have been expanding that vision for us for centuries. What I mean is, as a culture, we are finally going, oh, that is horrible. But that is caused by this understanding called anti-Black racist. And so many of us are like, oh my gosh, like a collective, like you finally got that, right? And so I guess, to decolonize whiteness is to call out those ways of not seeing and replace them with actual other actions, right? My dogs are going to bark soon. They're in another space, but they're so loud. If you hear them, apologies.
No, that's fine.
I think that, I mean, that's what I mean. It's just like, we don't just have to say, oh, treat Black people better and everything will be okay. That is just not, or we just need to stop doing that. That's what people were saying in 2016, 2013, 2014. Now they're like, wait a minute. There's structures which make that possible all the time. So they're finally turning and inclining their heads in another direction. And our children are doing that. And I couldn't be more proud of the work of artists and scholars and teachers, because I think it's our collective work in the last 30 years.
Right.
Let's turn the head of this next generation toward justice. And I think Cornel West said it best, justice is what love looks like in public. And that
Right.
to me is like a central ethic. Like, so if I think of justice for other beings that I inhabit this planet with, right? I think of West's statement isn't necessarily confined to human being.
Right.
Justice for everyone. And at this moment, that meme that was going around on Twitter, that was just like, it's like Mother Earth sent us all to our rooms to think about what we've done. And I've been deeply thinking about what we've done. Where we're living in these smaller pods is where we need to stay. We need to stop flying around and driving around and doing all that stuff. We need to heal ourselves, because climate change isn't about healing the planet. She's going to be just fine.
Absolutely.
Climate change is about an extinction event for human being.
Yes.
Right.
I think it's been politicized as, the tree hugging people want you to give up your human rights. And it's like, no. The tree hugging people actually believe in the planet and being human beings. I would like to live. So we're going to have to do some different things in order to live.
Right. This conversation has been incredible, because we could go on for hours.
I know, right?
Yes.
Let me go get my microwave lunch, right?
Right. But I want to, before I thank you for your generosity, I want to end the discussion or the conversation with the quote that you gave us. How failure is how we create intimacy, and I always mention that to artists, because I'm very cynical. I don't believe in hope, because it's a form of social empathy. I only believe in action as a possible.
Empathy is us.
Exactly, right. Empathy is part of the problem, or if not the problem. So one of the things that I've learned through the residency, because I challenge artists all the time and I displace them so that they feel uncomfortable, so that even the notion of whiteness is out of the space, so that they can also free up, because how we see someone says more about ourselves than the person that we're actually looking at. So this possibility of failure and how we create intimacy, as Audre mentioned it, as that friction that makes us be moved into a different place and will never stay the same, is what we're aiming for. And what I've learned through the process is that although art is always against us, because it always celebrates extermination and extinction and the appropriation of labor, what I find in a way closer to hope is that artists choose these questions. They might not be able to answer them. They might even make it worse for the world. They might even occupy other bodies. And however, the process of keeping the question near themselves, and sometimes it's their entire life, and that possibility of embracing failure is what can create intimacy in the encounters, so that we can see each other. And to me, that's what is really valuable about residencies. That's what we do, what we are actually doing. I always say that Architopia is not the place, it's actually the space in which we encounter. So it's that relationship that we establish. So I've enjoyed this conversation so much. And if there's anything you would like to add?
I think that's beautifully said. I mean, I always find in my classroom, I say to my students, this is a container for whatever it is we're going to create together here. My assumption is always intimacy. We work from there. Like, what do you want to know today? What are you not wanting to see? So I love what you just said. Thank you so much. I am so honored by your reaching out to me, and so honored by the use of my work, the usefulness of my work to your project. And I pray in my own little way for the health of the people on this planet and our planet. And I hope that one of these days we'll see each other.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Absolutely. And I wanted to say, we want to thank you for your generous knowledge. And just like you said, justice can only happen in public. I want to also say in public that this is your home and it's open for you. And whenever it's possible for you to come, the door is open always.
All right. Well, I'll take you up on that. I'm really excited. Thank you both so much for such a wonderful discussion.
It's our pleasure.
It's our pleasure, and we will be waiting for you here.
Yes.
Okay.